Would the gentleman yield for a question? The words hung in the air of the ornate hearing room as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett rose from her seat, a leather portfolio clutched firmly in her hand. Congressman James Reynolds, in the middle of his blistering attack on Attorney General Merrick Garland, paused mid-sentence. His expression flickered between annoyance and confusion at the unexpected interruption. "I have limited time, Congresswoman," he replied dismissively. "Just one question," Crockett insisted. "Are you aware that the very allegations you're making right now were investigated by this committee 3 months ago and conclusively disproven?" The chamber fell silent. Reynolds' confident demeanor wavered momentarily. Behind him, his chief of staff's eyes widened in visible alarm. "That's patently false," Reynolds recovered, his voice rising. "There's been no such investigation." Crockett opened her portfolio with deliberate calm. "Mr. Chairman, I request unanimous consent to enter into the record the committee's own report, dated March 12th, containing sworn testimony from career officials directly contradicting everything Congressman Reynolds just claimed." Attorney General Garland, who had endured hours of accusations with stoic patience, looked up sharply. For the first time that day, genuine surprise registered on his face as he watched this unexpected defender methodically dismantle what had seemed like an unstoppable political assault. In the press gallery, reporters scrambled for their phones. Committee staffers exchanged bewildered glances. And as the chairman reluctantly granted Crockett's request, it became clear to everyone in the room. The narrative that had dominated headlines for months was about to be turned upside down. If you're fascinated by these pivotal moments where truth cuts through political theater, hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss our analysis of what happened next in this extraordinary confrontation that changed the course of a major Justice Department investigation. The Justice Department oversight hearing had begun like countless others before it. The ornate hearing room, with its rich wood paneling and imposing columns, had seen generations of political theater, but today's session promised to be particularly contentious. For months, certain members of Congress had been waging an aggressive campaign against Attorney General Merrick Garland, accusing his department of weaponization and two-tiered justice. At 70 years old, Garland embodied the traditional image of America's top law enforcement officer. His thin frame, silver hair, and perpetually serious expression behind wire-rimmed glasses gave him the appearance of an academic rather than a political fighter. His distinguished career included serving as a federal judge for over 2 decades and being nominated to the Supreme Court, a seat he never got to fill due to political maneuvering. Now, as Attorney General, he led the Department of Justice with the same measured, methodical approach that had defined his judicial career. Across the aisle sat Congressman James Reynolds, a rising star in his party and one of the most vocal critics of the Justice Department. With his perfectly tailored suits, camera-ready appearance, and talent for crafting viral sound bites, Reynolds had built his reputation by launching blistering attacks against the administration. His questioning style was aggressive and often personal, designed more for social media clips than substantive oversight. "The American people deserve to know why your department treats citizens differently based on their political affiliations," Reynolds had declared earlier in the hearing, his voice rising for emphasis. "We've seen peaceful protesters treated like terrorists while actual criminals walk free because they have the right connections." Garland had responded with his characteristic restraint, explaining department policies and the independence of career prosecutors, but Reynolds had dismissed these explanations as bureaucratic excuses. The exchange had grown increasingly heated, with Reynolds interrupting Garland repeatedly and not allowing him to complete his answers. Sitting several seats away, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett observed the performance with growing concern. At 42, the freshman representative from Texas brought something different to the committee: extensive real-world experience as a civil rights attorney and criminal defense lawyer. Before entering politics, she had spent years in courtrooms defending clients against serious charges, often against overwhelming odds. While her colleagues saw these hearings as opportunities for political point scoring, Crockett viewed them through the lens of a trial attorney. She recognized the difference between allegations and evidence, between political theater and genuine oversight. And what she was witnessing troubled her deeply. not just as a member of Congress, but as someone who had dedicated her career to the principles of justice. 3 days earlier, Crockett had requested a comprehensive briefing from her staff on the specific allegations being made against the Department of Justice. Instead of accepting the talking points circulating among her colleagues, she had instructed her team to gather actual data, court filings, and detailed case histories. "I don't want narratives," she had told her chief of staff. "I want facts. I want numbers. I want documents that would stand up in court." Her staff had worked around the clock, compiling prosecution statistics, analyzing case outcomes, and documenting the department's handling of politically sensitive investigations across multiple administrations. The picture that emerged was starkly different from the one being painted in committee hearings and cable news segments. As Reynolds concluded his questioning with a dramatic call for the Attorney General's resignation, Crockett reviewed her notes one final time. The chairman's voice cut through her concentration. "The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas for 5 minutes." Crockett stood, straightened her blazer, and approached the microphone with the calm confidence of a seasoned trial attorney about to deliver an opening statement. Unlike many of her colleagues, she had not prepared remarks designed for social media clips or campaign fundraising emails. She had prepared a case, built on evidence, aimed at uncovering the truth. "What did you think of Congressman Reynolds' aggressive questioning style? Do you believe political hearings should be more about getting facts or creating dramatic moments? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective on effective congressional oversight." "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," Congresswoman Crockett began, her voice carrying the measured tone of an experienced courtroom attorney. "Attorney General Garland, I want to thank you for your patience today. I know it's not easy to sit through hours of questioning, especially when you're not always given the opportunity to fully respond." She arranged several documents on the podium before her, taking her time, establishing a different rhythm from the rapid-fire accusations that had dominated the morning. The room, which had been filled with murmurs and side conversations, gradually fell silent as observers sensed a shift in approach. "Attorney General, my colleagues have made serious allegations about the Department of Justice applying different standards based on political affiliation. These are claims that strike at the very heart of our justice system's integrity. Would you agree that such allegations, if true, would represent a fundamental betrayal of the department's mission?" Garland leaned toward his microphone. "Yes, Congresswoman. Equal application of the law is the cornerstone of the Justice Department's mission. It's what our career prosecutors and agents strive for every day." Crockett nodded. "Then let's examine the evidence behind these allegations, shall we?" She held up a thick document. "I have here a comprehensive analysis of federal prosecutions over the past 3 administrations, broken down by the political affiliation of the defendants when such affiliation could be determined. This data comes directly from court records and the department's own published statistics." She turned to face Congressman Reynolds directly. "My colleague just stated with great confidence that the current Department of Justice systematically favors Democrats over Republicans in its prosecutorial decisions. If that were true, we would expect to see a significant statistical disparity in prosecution rates, wouldn't we?" Reynolds shifted uncomfortably but maintained his confident expression. "The numbers don't tell the whole story. It's about who gets charged and who doesn't." "Let's look at exactly that," Crockett replied, her tone remaining professional rather than confrontational. She turned to a specific page in her document. "According to these verified records, under the current administration, the Department of Justice has prosecuted 73 politically connected individuals, 41 Democrats, and 32 Republicans. Under the previous administration, the department prosecuted 68 such individuals, 29 Democrats and 39 Republicans." A murmur swept through the chamber. These weren't the numbers most committee members had expected. "Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter this full statistical analysis into the record," Crockett said, handing the document to a committee aide. Before Reynolds could interject, Crockett continued, "Now, my colleague specifically mentioned the case of Senator Martin's aide, suggesting he received preferential treatment. Let's examine that. Claim specifically." She produced another document. "I have here the sentencing guidelines and actual sentences imposed in similar financial disclosure cases over the past decade. In the case of Senator Martin's aide, the sentence was actually 8% higher than the average for comparable offenses with similar circumstances. Reynolds leaned forward. "Mr. Chairman, I question the source of the gentlewoman's information." "The source, Congressman," Crockett responded calmly, "is the U.S. Sentencing Commission's own database, which I'd be happy to make available to you and your staff. These aren't partisan talking points. They're official government records." The dynamic in the room was shifting palpably. Republican members who had been nodding along with Reynolds' earlier questioning now looked uncertain. Democrats who had been defensive were sitting up straighter. Crockett turned her attention back to Garland. "Attorney General, we've also heard repeated claims about the department using excessive force when arresting certain individuals. My colleague mentioned, and I quote, pre-dawn raids with tactical teams against non-violent offenders." She held up another document. "I have here the arrest protocols followed in the cases my colleague referenced. Could you explain to the committee whether these protocols differed from standard department procedures for similar cases, regardless of the defendant's political affiliation?" Garland seemed to appreciate the opportunity to address this specific allegation. The protocols followed in those cases were entirely standard and based on factors including flight risk, destruction of evidence risk, and officer safety assessments, the same factors we consider in every case. There was no deviation from standard procedure. Crockett nodded. "And just to be clear, these same protocols were used in comparable cases during previous administrations as well, correct?" "That is correct," Garland confirmed. Crockett then produced what would become the most devastating evidence of the hearing, a series of statements made by Congressman Reynolds himself during the previous administration. "Mr. Chairman, I find it interesting that my colleague is so concerned about political influence over the Justice Department today. I have here a statement he made in 2018, and I quote, 'The Department of Justice must remain independent from political pressure. Congressional attempts to direct prosecutorial decisions in specific cases undermine the very foundation of our system of justice.'" She looked directly at Reynolds. That was Congressman Reynolds speaking forcefully against congressional pressure on the Justice Department when a different administration was in power. I'm curious what changed his perspective on DOJ independence. Reynolds' face flushed visibly. He whispered urgently to an aide who began frantically searching through papers. Crockett wasn't finished. She produced another document. "Attorney General, my colleagues have repeatedly claimed that you've been uniquely unresponsive to congressional oversight. I have here a statistical comparison of document productions, testimony hours, and formal responses to congressional inquiries from your department compared to the same department under the previous 3 administrations." She displayed a chart clearly visible to the committee members and the cameras. "The data shows that your department has actually provided 28% more documents, given 34% more hours of testimony, and responded to 17% more congressional inquiries than your predecessor did during a comparable period." The room had grown completely silent. What had begun as a routine partisan hearing had transformed into something else entirely, a methodical, evidence-based dismantling of political narratives that had been accepted as fact for months. Crockett paused briefly, allowing the weight of the evidence she had presented to settle over the hearing room. The atmosphere had shifted noticeably. Reporters who had been scrolling through their phones now sat fully attentive. Committee members were leaning forward in their seats, and even the usually impassive Attorney General Garland seemed to be watching Crockett with newfound interest. She then turned to address what had been one of the most publicized allegations against the Department of Justice, the claim that it had deliberately slow-walked certain high-profile investigations while fast-tracking others. "Attorney General Garland," she continued, her voice carrying effortlessly through the now silent chamber, "perhaps the most serious allegation we've heard today concerns the timeline of the Wallace investigation compared to the Donovan case. My colleague suggested that this disparity could only be explained by political bias." She signaled to her aide, who approached with a large visual display board. "I've prepared a detailed comparison of these 2 cases, tracking each investigative step, each witness interview, each document request, and each court filing." The display showed 2 parallel timelines, color-coded and meticulously documented. Crockett walked the committee through it with the precision of a prosecutor addressing a jury. As this timeline demonstrates, the Wallace investigation involved 142 witnesses compared to 37 in the Donovan case. It required analysis of over 300,000 documents compared to approximately 18,000. It involved alleged conduct spanning 7 years rather than 9 months. It required coordination with 5 different regulatory agencies rather than one. She pointed to specific milestones on the chart. When we adjust for complexity factors, a standard practice in any fair comparison of case management, we find that the Wallace investigation actually progressed 22% faster than comparable cases of similar complexity in previous administrations. The data was so comprehensive, so irrefutable, that several committee members were taking photographs of the display with their phones. A Republican congressman whispered something to his Democratic colleague, who nodded in apparent agreement. Crockett turned directly to Reynolds, who had been the most vocal proponent of the politically motivated delay theory. Given these facts, would my colleague still maintain that the different timelines can only be explained by political bias? Or might the complexity and scope of the respective investigations be the more logical explanation? Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but remained silent, his usual confidence visibly shaken. For the first time all day, he seemed at a loss for words. Sensing the momentum, Crockett moved to what would become the most dramatic moment of the hearing. She produced a sealed folder from her briefcase, its contents previously unseen by anyone in the room. Mr. Chairman, before proceeding, I want to be absolutely clear about the provenance of these documents. They were provided to my office through official channels following a formal request to the National Archives. They are not classified, they are not privileged, and they are properly before this committee. The clarification was necessary given the sensitivity of what was to come. She opened the folder with deliberate care. What I have here are Internal Justice Department memoranda from 2018 and 2019, when the department was under different leadership. These memos outline the exact same investigative protocols being used today. The same protocols that my colleagues are now claiming represent political weaponization. She extracted several pages and held them up. This memo, dated June 12, 2018, specifically instructs prosecutors to follow the very procedures that Congressman Reynolds characterized earlier today as unprecedented partisan targeting. The revelation landed like a thunderclap. These weren't just statistics that could be disputed or reinterpreted. These were the department's own words contradicting the narrative that had been built against it. And most significantly, Crockett continued, this policy memorandum is signed by none other than Deputy Attorney General William Bennett, who was appointed by the previous president and who now appears regularly on television criticizing these same procedures. Reynolds could no longer remain silent. Mr. Chairman, I question the relevance of policies from a previous administration. Crockett responded immediately. The relevance, Congressman, is that you and others have repeatedly claimed these procedures represent a radical departure from traditional Justice Department practice and evidence of political motivation. These documents prove definitively that they are, in fact, long-standing department protocols that transcend administrations. She wasn't finished. From the same folder, she produced another document, this one clearly marked with the congressional letterhead. Perhaps even more revealing is this letter, dated September 3, 2019, signed by Congressman Reynolds himself, commending the Department of Justice for its thorough and appropriate investigative procedures in a case involving a Democratic governor, the same procedures he was now condemning. The committee room fell completely silent. Even the chairman seemed momentarily stunned by the methodical dismantling of narratives that had dominated political discourse for months. Reynolds attempted to regain control. Mr. Chairman, the gentlewoman is clearly engaged in a political attack rather than oversight. The chairman, who had previously seemed sympathetic to Reynolds's position, now appeared less certain. The chair will allow the gentlewoman to continue, as these documents appear relevant to the department's practices, which are the subject of this hearing. It was a subtle but significant shift, an acknowledgement that evidence was prevailing over allegation. Crockett then executed her most devastating move of the hearing. She produced yet another folder containing internal memos from Congressman Reynolds' own office. Mr. Chairman, I recently received these documents from a concerned former staff member of Congressman Reynolds' office. They appear to be talking points prepared for today's hearing, dated 3 weeks ago. She held up the papers. What's troubling is that these talking points explicitly acknowledge that many of the allegations being made against the Department of Justice lack factual support. The room erupted. Reynolds jumped to his feet, his face flushed with anger. Point of order, Mr. Chairman. Those are allegedly stolen internal documents that have no place in these proceedings. The chairman gavelled repeatedly for order, the sound echoing through the chamber. Order! The committee will come to order. When the commotion subsided, he addressed Crockett. The gentlewoman will refrain from referencing allegedly stolen documents. Crockett nodded respectfully. I understand, Mr. Chairman. Let me approach this differently. She set aside the documents and turned back to Garland, who had watched the exchange with an expression of careful neutrality that didn't quite conceal his surprise at the thoroughness of Crockett's preparation. Attorney General, when prosecutors bring cases to court, they're ethically bound to have evidence supporting their allegations, correct? Garland leaned toward his microphone. Yes, Congresswoman. Prosecutors have an ethical obligation not to bring charges they cannot support with evidence. And if a prosecutor were to make allegations in court while knowing they lacked factual basis, what would the consequences be? At minimum, professional sanctions, Garland replied, his voice carrying the authority of his years on the federal bench. Potentially disbarment in serious cases. The justice system cannot function if officers of the court make unfounded allegations. I've prosecuted cases and I've defended them, Crockett noted. In both roles, I was accountable for the factual claims I made in court. She paused, letting the implication hang in the air. So, there's accountability for attorneys who make false allegations in court. Yet, here in Congress, members can make equally serious allegations against the Department of Justice without any evidence and face no consequences. Would you say that creates a troubling double standard? Before Garland could answer, Reynolds interrupted again, his voice strained. Mr. Chairman, the gentlewoman is attacking the integrity of members of this committee. The chairman looked at Crockett, his expression now thoughtful rather than admonishing. I would remind the gentlewoman to focus her questions on oversight of the Department of Justice. With respect, Mr. Chairman, Crockett responded, her voice firm, but not confrontational. That's precisely what I'm doing. This committee's oversight function is undermined when allegations are made without factual basis. The American people deserve better than conspiracy theories and political theater. They deserve evidence-based oversight. Several members of the committee nodded in agreement, notably from both parties. What had begun as a partisan exercise was evolving into something else entirely. Crockett returned her attention to Garland for what would become the defining exchange of the hearing. Attorney General, my final question is simple but significant. In your decades of public service, as a prosecutor, as a judge, and now as Attorney General, have you ever made a prosecutorial decision based on the political affiliation of the subject rather than the facts and the law? The room fell completely silent. This was the core allegation that had been repeated in countless hearings, cable news segments, and social media posts, that Garland had weaponized the Justice Department against political opponents. Garland sat up straight, removed his glasses, and looked directly at Crockett. His voice, usually measured and reserved, carried a rare emotional weight as he responded. Never, Congresswoman, not once in my career. He paused, then added with unmistakable conviction, and I would resign immediately if anyone in the department made such a suggestion. The day the Department of Justice makes prosecutorial decisions based on politics rather than evidence is the day the rule of law dies in America. The power of his statement, its simplicity and evident sincerity, seemed to resonate even with his critics. For months, he had been portrayed as a partisan operator, but in this moment, his lifelong commitment to judicial independence was unmistakable. Crockett nodded. Thank you, Attorney General. I believe you, and I believe the evidence supports you. She turned to face the full committee, sweeping her gaze across both sides of the aisle. The serious work of congressional oversight requires more than accusations. It requires evidence. It requires intellectual honesty. And it requires us to care more about the truth than about partisan advantage. As she yielded back her time, something unprecedented happened. From the public gallery, Spontaneous applause erupted. Several citizens rose to their feet. The chairman banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. But the moment had been registered. Even several Republican members of the committee were nodding in grudging respect at the thoroughness of her presentation. Reynolds sat motionless, his carefully prepared attack lines rendered useless by Crockett's methodical dismantling of the very premises on which they were built. His aide slid a note in front of him, but he pushed it away, seemingly recognizing that no talking point could counter what had just occurred. Garland, who had maintained his composure throughout hours of accusations and interruptions, allowed himself a visible moment of relief. The corner of his mouth turned up slightly in what might have been the beginning of a smile, quickly suppressed and returned to his characteristic poker face. But those watching closely saw it, a flash of gratitude that someone had finally brought evidence to a fight that had been dominated by allegations. An experienced reporter in the press section whispered to her colleague, "In 20 years covering Congress, I've never seen anyone methodically dismantle political narratives like that." She didn't just defend Garland, she changed the entire conversation. As the hearing moved to the next questioner, the atmosphere in the room had fundamentally changed. Staff members were furiously revising questions based on what had transpired. Reporters were rewriting stories that had been pre-drafted with different expectations. What had begun as another partisan exercise had been transformed by Crockett's presentation into something that rarely happened in modern politics, a genuine search for truth based on evidence rather than allegation. The impact of Congresswoman Crockett's methodical defense of the Department of Justice was both immediate and far-reaching. As the hearing adjourned, the marble hallways of the Capitol filled with reporters scrambling to rewrite stories that had been pre-drafted with the assumption that the hearing would follow the usual partisan script. Crockett turns tables with "Evidence Blitz," read the first digital headline from the Washington Post. "Texas Congresswoman brings receipts to DOJ hearing," declared another. Video clips of her questioning spread rapidly across social media, with one exchange garnering over 3 million views in the first hour alone. Outside the hearing room, seasoned political observers struggled to process what they had witnessed. A veteran correspondent for a major network was overheard telling her producer, "In 20 years covering Congress, I've never seen someone so thoroughly dismantle political talking points with actual evidence. This wasn't partisan counterattack. This was just facts winning." For Attorney General Garland, who had endured months of increasingly personal attacks on his integrity and leadership, the afternoon marked a turning point. As he gathered his materials to leave, 3 senior career prosecutors from the Justice Department, who had been observing the hearing, approached him. "Thank you for maintaining the department's independence through all this, sir," one said quietly. "Today meant a lot to the career staff." Garland nodded, his expression solemn, but with unmistakable appreciation in his eyes. For months, he had absorbed the political attacks without responding in kind, believing that the Justice Department's credibility depended on remaining above the political fray. Today, someone else had stood up for the institution he had dedicated his career to protecting. In her office later that afternoon, Crockett was surprised by a call from an unexpected source, a senior Republican senator who had been watching the hearing. "Congresswoman," he said, "I don't agree with your politics, and I still have concerns about some DOJ actions. But what you did today, bringing evidence rather than just allegations, that's how oversight is supposed to work. We need more of that on both sides of the aisle." The broader impact on Washington's political culture was subtle but significant. In the weeks that followed, several previously scheduled hearings featuring inflammatory titles about weaponization were quietly renamed to more neutral descriptions. Committee staff began requesting more specific data and documentation, rather than relying on anecdotal examples. A month after the hearing, a respected polling organization found a small but measurable increase in public confidence in the justice system, the first such increase in over 2 years. The analysis attributed this shift partly to increased public awareness of actual Justice Department data versus political narratives. Perhaps most significantly, law schools across the country began using video of Crockett's questioning as a teaching tool. At Georgetown Law, Professor Miranda Chen told her students, "Notice how she never resorts to personal attacks or partisan rhetoric. She simply presents evidence that contradicts specific allegations. This is effective advocacy in its purest form. For Congressman Reynolds, the aftermath was complicated. Initially, he attempted to dismiss Crockett's presentation as cherry-picked data, but this claim faltered when fact-checkers confirmed the accuracy of her statistics. His once rising star dimmed slightly as colleagues became more cautious about repeating his allegations without verification. 2 months after the hearing, Reynolds approached Crockett on the House floor during a vote. "That was quite a performance," he said, his tone difficult to read. "It wasn't a performance, Congressman," she replied evenly. "Just evidence." Reynolds nodded slowly. "Well, you've certainly made things more difficult. Now my staff insists on verifying claims before I make them public." There was the faintest hint of respect in his voice. "Sounds like they're doing their job," Crockett responded with a slight smile. 6 months later, Crockett was invited to speak at the Justice Department's Great Hall to an audience of career prosecutors and FBI agents. The Attorney General introduced her personally. "Congresswoman Crockett reminded us all of something essential," Garland said. "In a time when truth often seems less important than narrative, she demonstrated that facts, methodically presented, still have the power to change minds. She showed that oversight based on evidence rather than allegation strengthens rather than weakens our institutions." As Crockett approached the podium to enthusiastic applause, she reflected on how a single congressional hearing had transformed her from a freshman representative to a national voice for evidence-based politics. The path forward wouldn't be easy. The pull of partisan narratives remained strong, and many found it more comfortable to embrace allegations that confirmed their existing beliefs rather than confront evidence that challenged them. But something had changed that day in the hearing room. A standard had been set. A different approach had been demonstrated, and for a brief moment, politics had been forced to reckon with something more powerful than accusation: the simple, unvarnished truth. As this remarkable story continues to influence American politics, we hope you found this detailed analysis valuable. If you appreciate content that goes beyond surface-level coverage to examine the real dynamics of political confrontation, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We're committed to bringing you in-depth analysis of the moments that matter in Washington and beyond. And don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments section below. We'd love to hear your perspective on how evidence-based oversight could transform our political discourse.